In this video, I will be reflecting upon Kant's moral philosophy. Why Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy is known as pure ethics. Before we begin, we shall try to understand the background of his advocacy of pure ethics. During and before his time, European philosophy had a predominance of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism began with the writing of Epicurus. Epicurus was a Greek philosopher. He advocated qualitative hedonism. Hedonism refers to happiness or pleasure. But it gained full development in the hand of Jeremy Bentham. But Jeremy Bentham propounded quantitative happiness. Like for him, happiness can be quantified by means of certain criteria. And then J.S. Mill took it to the pinnacle, and his account of utilitarianism emphasized on the qualitative happiness, and it is known with the dictum greatest number of happiness for the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, the supreme principle of morality according to J.S. Mill. So this was the background of Immanuel Kant, although J.S. Mill born 2 years after Immanuel Kant. So basically, before and during Immanuel Kant's time, philosophers remained steadfast to the consequentialism line of thinking in terms of moral philosophy. But Immanuel Kant deviated from this line of thinking, and he advocated deontology. Deontology is opposed theory of consequentialism. Consequentialism talks about consequences or result of a certain action. According to this line of thinking, rightness or wrongness or goodness of an action lies in the consequence of a certain activity. And opposed to that, deontology solely focuses on the action. They emphasize that goodness of an action is good in itself. So it is intrinsically good, and they do not care for the consequences. So consequences does not add or take away anything goodness from the action. Goodness of an action is determined by the action itself according to the deontological line of thinking. So the prominent advocate of deontological line of thinking is Immanuel Kant. Anyway, this was the background of pure ethics. So why is Kant's philosophy, moral philosophy, came to be known as, he delineated his philosophy as moral philosophy, pure ethics. There is a reason. Pure here refers to something that is not empirical. Okay. Throughout the groundwork, Kant's main objective was to find out the supreme principle of morality. And his project was to look for the inevitable demand of reason, because he believed that human being is different from rest of the creatures on account of the existence of reason in human life. Okay. So what is the inevitable demand of reason in human life? That was the sole objective of Immanuel Kant's moral philosophy, to find out the fundamental principle of morality. And why reason is coming here? Because that fundamental principle of morality will be the uh, demand for reason, because human being is different from animal, other creatures. Okay, human action, human behavior is distinguished from rest of the creatures behaviors, because they have the ability to make choice, and making that ability to make choice, or that volition, actually comes from the faculty reason. That is why he is talking about the reason. He was looking for the inevitable demand of reason of a rational being, and he thought that only a priori principle can fulfill that demand. So a priori means that which is not empirical, that which can be known independent of sense experience, with the help of reasons alone. So he was looking for a priori principle that will be the fundamental principle of morality, and will fulfill the demand of reason. Okay, so when he was talking about the pure ethics, he has in mind that the ability to self legislate, to legislate for a desire, the ability of self legislation, the ability to self legislate for self regulation, to make law and then obey law. So who will be making law? Our reason will make law for what? For regulating its desires, passion, etc. Okay, that is why a shift can be found in his groundwork. So from the nomenclature, very nomenclature of the chapters of the groundwork, if we see that transition from popular moral philosophy, transition from ordinary knowledge of morality to philosophical, and another chapter is entitled as transition from popular moral philosophy to metaphysics of moral. So a transition is very much conspicuous. Okay, a transition from ordinary knowledge of morality to philosophical, a transition from the popular moral philosophy to the metaphysic of morals. So he shifted his attention from observation of human behavior, okay, and then making generalization from this to an ethical theory. So instead of observing human behavior and then making a generalization to form an ethical theory, he didn't do this thing. Okay, rather he shifted his attention to the reason, the rational faculty of human being, and to find out the supreme principle of morality, that will be a priori. And once this is established, any sort of activity that are drawn from experience can be judged in the light of that principle, whether it is conforming to it or not. Okay, that is why he was against using example and basing his ethical teachings on example, because he was aware of the danger of doing that, because it may give us the impression that the concept of duty or supreme principle of morality is a result of generalization from several human experiences, from how men actually work, okay, behave. So this may result into a confusion of moral with non-moral. If the supreme principle of morality is a result of a generalization from various human experiences, how human beings behave, how human beings act, then it will end up with a confusion with the motive, moral and non-moral motives. Okay, So he was against using examples. That example using not using examples had three main reasons in Kant's moral philosophy. First reason is that for him we can find no example of moral action. Okay, since the action of human being for the action of human being, motive is always obscure. Okay, so how can one determine that certain action is moral or non-moral if the methodology is to observe the various human behavior and then make a generalization on the basis of those observation? Like this induction process, he was not in favor of establishing a simple supreme principle of morality through generalization, through induction, because it has a problem. It will end up with a confusion of mixing moral with non-moral, because we cannot find any example of human action that can be called moral, because we may call that this certain action is moral, certain action is immoral in our experiential level, in day-to-day experience we may call it, but if we carefully observe that, we will not find out the motive, because motive, we assume that he may be doing certain action out of a certain motive, but motive itself is a very obscure thing. We cannot know it as it is. We cannot know it what is the real motive underlying the activities. So this is the first reason Kant was against using example. And the second reason is the moral law, according to him, must be valid for all rational agent, and experience cannot provide us such universal principle. Okay, universal principle can never be established by experience, empirical knowledge, according to Immanuel Kant. And third reason was, example must be judged in the light of a priori principles, and consequently cannot enable us to dispense with an examination of these a priori principles. That means example must all be judged in the light of a priori principle. So there must be something a priori principle, and in the light of which particular activities that are basically drawn from experiences must be judged in the light of that a priori principle, whether they have moral worth or not. But for that we need to arrive at a supreme moral principle that must be a priori fully. So experience, instances of human behavior and observation on that will not help us at any way. That is why he is solely focusing on the inevitable demand of reason, and he believed that only a priori principle can fulfill that demand. So that is why his philosophy is known as pure ethics. Pure here implies that is devoid of any empirical element. It is arrived at by the reason itself. That is why a priori, independent of sense experience, and this will be able to form the supreme principle of morality. Reason will be able to form the supreme principle of morality, that will be a priori, and once this is established, we can judge any human activity from our experience, whether it is conforming to that principle or not, whether it is having moral worth or not. In fact, Kant has actually established supreme principle of morality, and that is known as categorical imperative, that we have already discussed in our last video in contrasting with hypothetical imperative. In the next video we shall be covering the three formulations of categorical imperative.